The Polish bull stepped out of the trailer first. Then, in turn, the two cows from Biolowieza. It was the 24th of April, 2007. The place was Kraansvlak, a closed-off strip of dune inside a Dutch national park about a 30-minute drive from Amsterdam. The three of them were the first free-living European bison anyone had put on Dutch ground in centuries. Bison are forest animals. Every textbook says so. And Kraansvlak, hemmed in by highways, a beach town, and a water utilities filtration fields, was not a forest. It was sand. Someone had made a BET that most of what the textbook said about bison was wrong. On around 120 hectares of grey dune, 30 minutes from the Rijksmuseum and 3 kilometers from the nearest beach town, 3 of the rarest large mammals in Europe were walking out onto ground everyone in Dutch conservation assumed they would refuse. The odds against them looked absurd. The European bison had been hunted to extinction in the wild by 1927, the last one shot in the Caucasus. Every living animal of the species descends from just 12 founders, kept in zoos and private estates when the last herds fell. Even after decades of careful captive breeding in Poland, letting 3 of them loose in the Netherlands, a country famous for 2 things, water engineering and having no wilderness left, sounded less like conservation than a stunt. The dunes themselves were dying, choked in grass, suffocating under scrub. The bare white sand that had defined this coast for 10,000 years was disappearing under a green mat that nobody could seem to peel back. Almost nobody in Dutch conservation thought it would work. Subscribe and watch them all be proven wrong. What those 3 bison walked into was older than the trailer, older than the reserve, older than the country itself. 10,000 years ago, when the ice retreated from northern Europe, the Dutch coast was built the same way it is built today. Wind pushed sand off a shallow sea. The sand piled into ridges, rain and salt and time carved the ridges into low hills. In between the hills, the sand stayed open. Bare, hot in summer. And in that hot, bare sand, a very specific set of small lives had evolved to fit. Sand lizards, laying eggs where the sun would cook them warm. Digger wasps, tunneling burrows only loose sand allows. Mining bees, boring nests in south-facing slopes. Tiger beetles, hunting on ground too hot for anything slower. And a small yellow flower called dune pansy that will only sprout where the sand is still moving. None of them can live in a mat of thick grass. They need light, they need heat. They need the sand to keep opening up under their feet. For most of that 10,000-year run, something kept the sand exposed. Wind was part of it. Rabbits were the other part, cropping the grass back to nothing across whole hillsides. And once in a very long while, something enormous walked through and knocked down what the wind and rabbits had missed. Then, in the 20th century, everything holding the system open began to fail at once. The rabbits collapsed under waves of disease. Traffic and agriculture began pumping nitrogen into the sky. And the sky rained it down onto the dunes like slow-motion fertilizer. Grass exploded. Scrub followed. The pioneer sand vanished under a green mat that seeded itself faster than anything left could eat it. That is the trap. Nothing on the ground could open the sand back up. The idea to answer that trap with the largest surviving mammal in Europe was first floated at a meeting in 2003. It came from an unlikely corner, not a rewilding NGO, a water company, PWN, the utility that manages drinking water for the province of North Holland, had been treating the dunes as a giant natural filter for decades. Their water passes through the sand before it reaches Amsterdam's taps. When the dunes get overgrown, the filter changes. Their nature manager, Leon Terlouw, and an outside consultant named Hans van der Lands looked at the problem and started asking a question no committee had asked before. What if the grazer we need is not a cow, or a sheep, or a horse? What if it is a bison? They pulled in 3 partners: a rewilding NGO called ARC, a small dune conservation foundation, and Polish researchers led by Rafał Kowalczyk at the Mammal Research Institute in Bialowice, whose work had already been quietly suggesting that these animals had never really been forest specialists at all. They were simply what was left after humans pushed everything else off the open plains. 2 Dutch biologists carried the project on the ground. Yvonne Kemp coordinated it for its first 7 years. Esther Rodriguez ran the field science. Rodriguez has told journalists what she was hearing at the time. Everyone in her network kept saying the same sentence: "The bison is the king of the forest. Are you sure you want to put them in the dunes?" They were sure. The plan itself was almost embarrassingly simple. They fenced off about 120 hectares of the worst affected dune. They brought in 3 animals, and a year later they brought in 3 more, 2 cows and a calf from Poland. 6 bison in total. Then they did the thing that separates this project from every other Dutch conservation program of the last century. They stopped. No supplementary feeding, not in the first winter, not in the 5th, not ever. No paddock rotation on a spreadsheet. No fertilizer, no mowing, no herbicide. The bison would eat what the dune produced, or they would leave. That was the whole management plan. And what the bison did with the dune, once they were left alone in one, turned out to be almost nothing like what conservation textbooks predicted a large grazer would do. They ate grass, every large grazer does, but they also ate the young scrub, biting off the tender new shoots on birch and willow before those had a chance to become the wall of woody plants, swallowing the reserve. Then they did something a cow will not do. They walked up to the mature trees, put their heads against the bark, and stripped it off in long ragged sheets with their teeth. A study led by Joris Kromseit at Utrecht University later found that this debarking kills or stunts woody plants at a much higher rate than the twig nibbling of cattle. The scrub was being pushed back not by rangers with chainsaws, but by a bison rubbing its face on a birch. Then came the piece nobody had planned for. Bison, like buffalo and like their extinct cousins, wallow. They dig into loose ground with their horns and their front legs, roll in the depression they make, and rise covered in dust. They do it to shed their winter coat, to chase off insects, to mark territory. What they leave behind on a dune is a wound, a patch of bare white sand, cleared of grass right down to the mineral, sometimes several meters across. That wound is the whole ecosystem coming back. Every sand lizard for a kilometer walks to a fresh wallow to bask belly flat, tongue out, in a landscape that had almost run out of warm, bare ground. Digger wasps, mining bees, and tiger beetles move into the exposed edges within a single season. The tiny yellow dune pansy, whose seeds had been sitting in the seed bank for years waiting for open ground, sprouts by the hundreds in the disturbed soil. And in the birch scrub nearby, blue tits and great tits started doing something ornithologists in adjacent dunes had never seen. Instead of lining their nests with moss, the way blue tits everywhere else in the Netherlands do, the Kraansvlak birds were flying home with beakfuls of shed bison hair. The cascade is short and it goes like this: bison strip bark and dig wallows. Wallows open the sand. Open sand host lizards, wasps, bees, and pioneer flowers. Flowers feed pollinators. Pollinators feed birds. Birds nest in warmer, insulated cups because the herd is shedding a coat evolved for a Polish winter into a Dutch summer. Everything that had been suffocating under grass could suddenly breathe. They came for the grass, but what they gave back was the sand. The first calf was born on Dutch soil in 2009. There had not been a wild-born bison in this country in living memory, or in any grandparent's living memory. By the end of 2018, the reserve had produced 33 calves, and the herd was up to 26 animals. The fenced area had been enlarged in stages from 120 hectares to 220, then to 240, and finally to about 330. The Bison Trail, a marked walking path threaded along the edge of the reserve, opened to the public in 2012. In its first decade, more than 50,000 people walked it. Not one was hurt. The science followed. Conic horses were added to the enclosure in 2009 and Scottish Highland cattle in 2016, making Kraansvlak the first place in Europe where all three of the continent's large grazers lived and could be studied on the same ground. An 8-year comparison led by Kraansvlak, published in 2018 in the journal Mammal Research, found that a bison-led grazing regime altered coastal dune vegetation at least as strongly as one led by cattle. A separate paper the same year, in Restoration Ecology, showed that the three species partitioned their diets cleanly enough to graze together without competing. By 2026, the Kraansvlak herd had exported 17 animals to a wild population in northern Spain, including 3 bulls in April of that year. Another 8 had gone to a rewilded reserve at Maashorst in the southern Netherlands in 2016. Smaller groups had been sent to Slikken, Van der Heen, and to other Dutch sites. In July 2022, the Kent Wildlife Trust and the Wildwood Trust released 3 founding cows into a fenced woodland in southern England called Wildest, a project designed, on paper, directly on the Kraansvlak template. An honest accounting has to name what is not yet settled. Kraansvlak is not a wilderness. The animals stand behind fences on land that is watched, counted, collared, and quietly culled toward a target number the managers have written down. The most photographed results, more butterflies, more grasshoppers, more flower visitors inside the bison zone, come from PWN's own project monitoring, rather than from peer-reviewed studies, and have to be treated as such until they are. Roughly 1 in 5 calves dies in the first year, which is normal for the species, but is not the storybook version. The herd size is deliberately managed by translocation, not left to grow, so the animals live inside a fence and inside a spreadsheet as much as inside a dune. And 330 hectares does not on its own save a species. It shows a small piece of what saving one can look like. Yvonne Kemp put it this way: "These are wild animals, we never forget that. And we are learning all the time." Walk the Bison Trail today, in late September, and you can hear the herd before you see it. A low breath, moving through the hollows. Then a shape on a ridge, dark against the sky, taller than the birch scrub around it. Below the ridge, in a bowl, a bull has dug for itself. Another animal has rolled its winter coat into a dusting of pale hair across the sand. And past the wallow, a sand lizard is sitting on the warm, exposed grain, as still as a piece of driftwood, doing what its ancestors did before the grass came. Here is what nobody at that first meeting in 2003 could have written into the plan. In a country of 18 million people, on a strip of sand smaller than most airports, the wildest animal in Europe is now digging holes for lizards. Which raises a question worth arguing about. If a bison can go back to work in 300 hectares between Amsterdam and the sea, what else are we keeping out of a landscape simply because we no longer think it belongs there? They came for the grass, they gave back the sand, and in the sand, everything else. If the mechanics of bringing a landscape back to life by inviting the largest available animal to disturb it interest you, subscribe. There are forests reopened by wild boar, coastlines held together by one stubborn grass, and prairies rebuilt by a returning bison herd. The logic behind each one is exactly as counterintuitive as this one.